you said your father was an icon painter, so I assume in a very traditional Orthodox style.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you ever explored that direction? Because of the Greek books, of the ancient Greek books, perhaps the most interesting are the ones that have drawings or inlays on them in this very old tradition. Have you ever thought of pursuing that?
You mean like Byzantine codices, something like that?
Ye-
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I've been wanting to do that, to explore that, but um, Byzantine binding is kind of intimidating. It's big, it's complex, it's heavy. It's not easy to get into it, but I'm hoping I'll try it at some point.
I guess I'm jumping ahead, but as a woodworker and metal worker, you seem to have the needed skill set to produce medieval binding, like all elements in one shop. Because you can do the wooden boards, you can do the metal elements, you can do everything. You can bind it together and make a design for the cover. So it seems like a job tailored for you.
Yeah, and that's why I have experimented with that a bit in a recent binding of mine. I want to make a correction. I don't do woodworking. The handles for my tools are made by wood turners.
Okay.
But that aside, it's true that I can do many of the things required, which usually need to make it necessary to cooperate with different people. And that's why it's very intriguing. It's, it seems within reach. And when you don't have to rely so much on others, you can experiment more easily. You can try things, and the only limit is your own skills.
Yeah.
Do you incorporate metal elements into your bindings? I
Well,
don't think I've seen that.
Most of my bindings are commission work, so unless the client requests for something like that, I don't. But I plan to do more of that in some projects of my own, because it's exciting. You can do anything really with that, as long as you prepare properly and you manage to pass the design obstacles. There's so much that can be done, and I don't feel it has been explored in a modern sense. Metal work on bindings. We're kind of left back. Mostly, there are some designers, some designer bookbinders, and some book artists that have explored it, but for the most part, it has remained, where it was in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance.
With some of our previous guests, we discussed that it's quite important for a book artist or maybe an artist in general not to be a slave to their own style and to experiment and to look around and think out of the box. And with at least some of your bindings, we can see that, and you mentioned it, that there is this trait that you use letters as elements of design. And the other thing is that it really seems that you like tooling, both blind tooling and gold tooling. I wouldn't say, though, that these are the traits of your bindings that are so persistent in all your works that this makes all the works look alike. So it's something that connects them, but still you do not look like a slave of your own style. But what do you think about it? What are your experiments? How you know try to think out of the box with your works?
Well, what you say is interesting because I actually don't feel I have achieved, at least to this point, to have a personal style. It's some of the things that I've been thinking a lot about and made some realization in recent time. And when it comes to letters, I think they lend themselves beautifully because people, font makers have actually put in the work to make them beautiful, to make them visually pleasing, but also practical in a sense. So it only makes sense using them as part of a design, and it also creates the continuity with the text that I mentioned earlier. But it's also an easy way to go around my inability to compose a design by drawing. That said, I try to experiment by challenging a bit myself. For example, recently a client requested me a couple of things that are totally out of my comfort zone, and I was really hesitant, but in the end I said, to hell with it, let's go, let's try it, why not? And I think it's sometimes in order to go out of the box you need a little nudge by someone, and sometimes you just want to try something that it's not exactly within your reach. So there's kind of a mix between those two.
I guess my next question has a bit of connection with this magic stuff, but not really magic, but maybe a weight of tradition or something. We had some guests from United States. They have pretty modern bookbinding tradition, which of course stays on the shoulders of European main European tradition, German, French, and British European tradition. And we also had some guests from France and from Great Britain. But then we started to move closer to Balkans, and we had a guest from Sofia, from Bulgaria, and we discussed the medieval bindings with him. And finally, we come to Greece, where, to sort of the cradle of European bookbinding and bookish tradition with Byzantine bindings and all that stuff. For one, do you feel this tradition backing you, and on the other hand, do you feel the weight of this tradition and the need to be divorced of it?
Well, it's strange because, as you said, there's a weight to this tradition, but there's also kind of a dissonance. There has been a great gap between, the Byzantine era to our era when it comes to bookbinding. Bookbinding had to be reintroduced to Greece after the 400-year occupation by the Ottomans. And so it was as if starting from scratch. And so this has led to the Byzantine bindings being more of a reference, something it kind of belongs to you, but not exactly. You don't feel it's there.
It's something like a dead language of bookbinding.
Yeah, kind of. And it's a pity, really, because there's a lot to explore there. And I was recently talking with someone who asked me, why don't you incorporate elements of that binding school into your work now? why don't you try to, to assimilate it creatively? And I really didn't have an answer for him, because it's something that one would expect we would have tried, but it's not easy. It also, I feel, would require a collaborative effort in that direction. It's as if reclaiming your past. It's not something that a single person, a single binder can do easily.
From what I understand, it's not just in bookbinding that there is this disconnect with Greece's Byzantine past. I often hear from my Greek friends that they feel deeper connection to the ancient Greek culture that was further back and lasted less than the great Byzantine culture that lasted for over 1,000 years.
Mm.
But that connection was lost not only through Turkish occupation, but also through nationalistic movements that followed them, because they wanted to connect themselves to the most ancient democracy and downplaying the authoritarian regime that was Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, that's true. There's also another thing that doesn't help in getting more to know the Byzantine era, which, as you mentioned, lasted a very long time. It's the fact that the many of the ancient, buildings or artifacts have sort of remained intact, while the remnants of the Byzantine era got lost in the constant remaking of cities. While, for example, ancient monuments have been buried, but the buildings of Byzantine era are not that long ago. They went through other uses as time went by, and they crumpled, and they were, taken apart and used anew as spolia. And that you have to piece together the Byzantine era more. You have to put more effort in putting together an image of the Byzantine era than you have to do for the ancient Greek era.
Well, you can still go to Thessaloniki, you can still go to the monasteries, you can still find it, but I guess the books and the paintings are all in the museums now, so they're no longer part of your everyday life. And Athens has hardly any Byzantine architecture, from what I remember.
Yeah, exactly. It's the religious aspect has survived more or less intact. It's the one thing that has remained the same practically, and that's the main connection. And I think it's a pity, because there are a lot of interesting things in the Byzantine era in many ways, in science, in literature, in architecture, and they often get overlooked because the ancient Greek era, which is of course very important, is a lot more prominent, is a lot more out there, is a lot more Greek, you could say. It's more difficult to find the connection with the Greek identity in the Byzantine era. So it makes sense that the nationalist movements try to reclaim the long past, the ancient past, and not the recent, you could say, past.
And speaking of the Byzantine bindings, do you have easy access to it? Can you just go to a museum and see masterpieces of that era? Because I certainly can. I can go to the Kremlin and I can see dozens and dozens of real masterpieces of that sort. But I don't know what the situation is back at you.
Well, there is the Byzantine Museum in the center of Athens, and it has quite a few um, bindings from that era that you can see, but not as many as you mentioned. For example, for the Kremlin, for example, you could visit some libraries that have some extraordinary bindings, but most people don't know about it, simply don't know about it. And there isn't a lot of effort in, making it more popular, making it more known. It is accessible, but you have to dig for it.
Or you need to go to places like Mount Athos, which is inaccessible
Yeah.
to half the population and also not exactly on the main track. You have to go there.
Yeah, it's a big trip. You have to plan for it. But if you are interested in books and bindings and the history of the written speech, the written word, it's definitely a trip worth doing. You have to. There's also a religious context to it, which I assume many people do not feel comfortable with. So maybe libraries and institutions which are more accessible should, put a little bit more effort. I understand it's not easy, and it's not a very marketable subject, but there's a lot of interesting things there, and there are many layers which someone can explore, about history, about books, about the craftsmen and the artisans that created those bindings. There are a lot of connections.